Hello there. In this video lesson, we're gonna try to cover the last section in the phonology course. We will try exactly to talk about phonological rules. We will try to target the following questions. First, what is a phonological rule? What do we mean by a phonological rule? Second, what are the pieces of information we need to include while writing phonological rules? And also, what are the types of phonological rules? Also, how do we write a phonological rule? What are the symbols that we need to master in order to write a phonological rule? At the end of this video, we're gonna also see some examples. We're gonna try to write phonological rules based on different data taken from different languages, be it English or other languages, and we try to write phonological rule statements and also phonological rule notations. So follow with me. One of the basic questions that is frequently asked by many linguists in the field of linguistics and any other sub-branch of linguistics, phonology, phonetics, syntax, morphology, etc., is exactly the question of what do you know when you know a language? What does it mean that you know a language? One of the possible answers to this question could be, when we know a language, we know exactly how to communicate using words of that language. We know how to engage in meaningful conversations using words again in that language. We know how to form meaningful sentences in that language. But the contribution of phonology as a sub-branch of linguistics to the answer of this question rests on the following answer. Phonology reveals exactly our subconscious knowledge towards the sounds or the system of sounds that exists in the language that we actually speak. So a part of what we know when we know English, for example, is our knowledge of the sounds that exist in that language, and it's our knowledge of the sounds that do not exist in that language. It's our knowledge of how we combine those sounds in that language. It's our knowledge of how sounds are pronounced in certain phonological environments. But hold on, this knowledge, a huge part of our knowledge or phonological knowledge, is unconscious. So phonology reveals exactly that subconscious knowledge. But here is a question. What are the rules exactly that govern our pronunciations of certain sounds in certain phonological environments? Let's take the American English as an example. If you look at these words in front of you, 4 words like team, steam, rat, and writer. The American pronunciation of these 4 words could be the following: team, steam, rat, writer. I repeat, team, steam, rat, writer. We notice in American English that the t sound has 4 different realizations. The t sound can be pronounced as an aspirated t, like in the word team, or it can be pronounced as an unaspirated t, a normal t, like in the word steam. T also can be pronounced or realized as an unreleased t, like in the word rat, rat. T also can be or can get flopped and pronounced like a r sound, like in the word writer, writer. So we notice that these 4 realizations of t is actually bound to a certain phonological context. It's exactly the phonological environment that exactly determines how the t sound is pronounced every time. From these 4 examples of the American pronunciation of the t, we can say that the pronunciation of the t is actually governed by certain phonological rules. There must be rules that actually determine where that t or when that t is going to be pronounced as either aspirated, unaspirated, unreleased, or flapped. There must be phonological environments, phonological contexts that actually govern its pronunciation. So a question to ask here is this: what are the particular phonological rules required to derive these four pronunciations, either the aspirated or unaspirated or the unreleased or the flapped t from the t itself? So what do we mean by a phonological rule? What's a phonological rule? In fact, when we write a phonological rule, we are simply representing that subconscious phonological knowledge that we have towards our native language in the form of rules. So that's why we say that when we explain or we state the exact conditions under which a phonological process takes place, or the exact conditions under which a certain pronunciation variation takes place, we are actually simply giving a phonological rule. Basically, phonological rules are two types. We have phonological rules that are informal, and we have phonological rules that are formal. When we write an informal phonological rule, we simply write statements in which we explain in plain English what happens to a certain sound and how it changes to another sound in a certain phonological environment. But when we write a formal phonological rule, we use notations, symbols in shorthand that explain what happens to a certain sound and how it changes to another sound in a certain phonological environment. So when we write an informal phonological rule, we can use the statement, the phoneme X changes to Y when it occurs before Z. And this statement can be changed to phonological rule notation, like X between slashes becomes Y between brackets whenever it is followed by Z. Now, how can we write a phonological rule? It's very important to bear in mind that when we write a phonological rule, be it a statement or a notation, three kinds of information must be there within the rule. First, which segment change. Second, how they change. Third, under what conditions. Which segment change refers to the phoneme that is affected. How they change refers to that phonetic change. And third, under what conditions refers to the phonological environment in which that change takes place. So when we write a phonological rule statement, be it formal or informal, be it a statement or a notation, we must include these three pieces of information. What is the phoneme that is affected? And how that phoneme is affected? What is that change? What is the phonetic change? And third, under which conditions? What is the phonological environment? What is the phonological context in which this change takes place? So when you write X becomes Y whenever it is followed by Z, X is exactly the phoneme that is affected, and Y is exactly the phonetic change, how that X changed. And also, before Z or when it is followed by Z is exactly the phonological context when that change takes place. Writing a phonological rule statement could be very easy for students, since we simply write in plain English exactly what happens to a certain sound and how it changes to another sound in a certain phonological environment. But when we write a phonological rule notation, we must master and memorize some symbols that we need to use in order to concisely and meticulously describe exactly what happens to that sound in that certain environment. For example, we use the slashes to refer to the phoneme, and we use the brackets to refer to the phonetic change. Also, in the phonological rule notation, we use one slash to say in the environment. or when or whenever. And we use the long dash to refer to the environment where exactly that phoneme is affected. That's exactly the place of the affected segment. And we use also in the phonological rule notation an arrow, which means it becomes changed to, pronounced, realized. And also we use a hashtag to refer to a word boundary. If that hashtag is actually following the dash or the environment, it signifies that we are talking about a word final position. But if that hashtag is before the environment or before the dash, that signifies that we are talking about a word initial position at the beginning of a word. We also use the S symbol like a dollar to refer to a syllable boundary. If that syllable boundary is if it is actually following the environment, if it is after the environment, that denotes a syllable final position at the end of a syllable. But if it is actually before the environment, before the dash, that denotes a syllable initial position, which is at the beginning of a syllable. Also, if you want to write a phonological rule notation, we use the capital V to refer to a vowel, and we use the capital C to signify a consonant, and we use also the capital G to refer to a glide. Also, to write a phonological rule notation, we can use the null symbol. If the null symbol is after the arrow, in the right hand of the arrow, it means it is deleted, or it is dropped, or it is not pronounced. But if the null symbol is before the arrow, that means there is an insertion. We say it is inserted, it is added. And we use the braces in the case when we are talking about more than one environment, when exactly that change is occurring in more than one environment. And we use the plus to refer to a morpheme boundary. Also, we use the parenthesis in order to refer to possibly. If you want to say possibly, for example, if there is a vowel C inside the parenthesis, we say that possibly there is a consonant. But if there is a V exactly inside the parenthesis, that means there is possibly a vowel. We also use the C with the subscript 0 to say that there might be 0 or more consonants, and we use the capital C for consonant with the superscript 2 and a subscript 0 to say that there might be between 0 and 2 consonants. Now let's see these examples of phonological rule notations and let's exactly read what exactly they mean. Number 1, we have X between slashes, arrow, and Y between brackets. We have a slash, we have a syllable boundary, and a dash. What does this mean? It simply means that the sound X is pronounced as Y when it is a syllable initial. Now the second example, we have X also again between slashes, followed by an arrow, then Y between brackets, then followed by a slash and a dash for environment and a syllable boundary. What does this rule mean exactly? Simply, it means that the sound X again is pronounced as Y when it is a syllable initial. The third example, we have X between slashes, followed by an arrow, and also followed by Y between brackets. Again, after that, we have a slash, followed by a dash and word boundary. What does this rule mean? It simply means that the sound X is pronounced as Y when it is a word final. Before we try to write phonological rules based on data from different languages, let me explain to you what happens when sometimes we might have more than one context or environment for the application of a certain rule, which is the case sometimes that we find that a sound is actually pronounced as another sound in two possible environments. In this case, and in order to write a rule, it's very important, as you can see in front of you, to use the braces. As you can see in front of you, we have X between slashes becomes Y between brackets, followed by a slash and a dash or environment. Then you open the braces and you put those two possible environments. What does this mean? It means simply that X changes to Y either before Z or at word boundary. Now let's start writing phonological rules. Let's start translating phonological rule statements into phonological rule notations. Now let's start with aspiration rule. Aspiration is a process, is a phonological process, which is exactly about a secondary modification, a puff of air, which is exactly a secondary modification that is superimposed on the primary articulation. For example, if we take these examples in front of you, pip, test, kick. Now, the pronunciation of p, t, k, which are voiceless stops, is actually changed to a very specific kind of pronunciation. As you can notice in the transcription, the sound as a superscript, as a secondary modification, is imposed on the primary articulations of these voice stops. So pip, test, kick. Now, what is the aspiration rule? What is the statement here? We notice that voice stops p, t, k are aspirated when they are syllable initial before stressed vowels. So this is exactly the aspiration rule statement. Voices stops p, t, k are aspirated when they are syllable initial before stressed vowels. Now, how can we translate these phonological rule statements into a formal phonological rule notation? We simply say that the consonant, which is minus sonorant, minus continuant, minus voice, becomes plus aspirated if it is syllable initial followed by a vowel that is stressed. As you can see in the phonological rule notation, we are using C for consonants, then we specify the features for that consonant because we are talking here about only voices stops. And what are the features for voices stops? Minus sonorant, minus continuant, and minus voice. Followed by an arrow, which means becomes or pronounced, and followed by the phonetic change, which is plus aspirated, and followed by a slash, which means when or whenever, and followed by a syllable boundary at the beginning or before the environment to say that it is syllable initial. Then followed by a vowel, V for vowel, then we specify under V the features for that specific vowel, since we are talking here about plus stressed vowels. So consonants that are minus sonorant, minus continuant, minus voice becomes plus aspirated in a syllable initial before or followed by a voice or stressed vowels. If aspiration is about a modification or an addition of a puff of air and the primary articulation of voices stops, unaspiration is about the opposite. It's exactly about the absence of that puff of air that is added on the pronunciation of voices stops. If you take the examples in front of you again, three words: stop, spot, and skip. The phonological transcription of the voiceless stops, as you can see in these three words, there is an absence of puff of air. There is an absence of the superscript, the h sound. So what we say here is stop. We don't say stop. What we say again here is spot. We don't say spot. Again, we say skip. We don't say skip. So the absence of puff of air in the pronunciation of voice stops is exactly what we call unaspiration. So to write a phonological rule statement describing exactly an aspiration rule, we simply say voice stops p, t, and k are unaspirated after s sound at the beginning of a syllable. I repeat, syllable stops p, t, k are unaspirated after s sound at the beginning of a syllable. Now let's translate this phonological rule statement into formal phonological rule notation. We simply write a consonant which is minus sonorant, minus continuant, minus voice becomes minus aspirated if it is preceded by a s sound at the beginning of a syllable. So we write C for consonant, underneath we open the brackets for the features of that specific sound, which is a voice stop, minus sonorant, minus continuant, minus voice, then followed by an arrow which means becomes or pronounced. Then we refer to the phonetic change minus aspirated, then we put a slash which is exactly if or when or whenever. Then we open the brackets for the s sound at the beginning of a syllable, then the environment. So we say a consonant that is minus sonorant, minus continuous, minus voice is pronounced or becomes unaspirated, minus aspirated whenever it is preceded by a s sound at the beginning of a syllable. Another phonological rule that is actually quite common in English is the one that has to do with lengthening, or specifically vowel length in English. Now, lengthening or vowel length in English is a phonological process that describes exactly what happens to certain vowels and why or how they become lengthened, long in a certain phonological context. And we've seen that lengthening in English has a very specific environment when it occurs. As you can see in the environment in front of you, we notice that lengthening is taking place only in the first three words here: bad, leave, sad. But it's not taking place in the other three words: bat, leave, sat. We repeat: bad, bat, leave, leave, sad, sat. So a phonological rule statement must be the following: vowels are lengthened before voiced consonants. When we try to analyze the environment in which lengthening is taking place, we notice that vowels become long or are lengthened whenever they are followed by voiced consonants. So this is exactly the phonological rule statement. Now, how can we translate this into phonological rule notation? We simply write V for vowels becomes V followed by two dots, which is long vowel, whenever it is followed by a consonant C, and we specify exactly the voicing plus voice. We say vowels becomes lengthened whenever they are followed by voiced consonants. So we write V between slashes to refer to the phoneme any vowel, and we put the arrow that means becomes or pronounced or realized as. Then we write the V for vowel, then we put the two dots to refer to exactly the lengthening, long vowels. Then we write or we put a slash to refer to the environment when or whenever, and we put the dash for the environment, and we put again the consonant and we specify the voicing plus voice. So vowel becomes long whenever it is followed by voiced consonants. Another quite common phonological rule or phonological process that exists in English is exactly the one we call nasalization. Nasalization is about nasalizing a vowel that is actually in its primary articulation is oral, it's not nasalized. But that vowel becomes nasalized in very specific environments, which is whenever they are followed by a consonant which is nasal. Now, if you look at these examples in front of you, you will see that vowels are normal in certain environments, like in sea and cat. But look what happens to those same vowels whenever they are followed by a nasal consonant. Look at the words seen, can't, damn, and dump. Now, we notice that in the transcription, in the phonological transcription of exactly the vowels, we notice that we are adding a superscript on vowels. That superscript is the one that actually denotes or signifies a nasalization of vowels. So there is a rule, there is a specific environment in which vowels become nasalized. So we say, as a phonological rule statement, a vowel gets nasalized in the environment before a nasal segment, possibly followed by a consonant in the same syllable. And that's exactly the case with many words. Take the example of seen, and, man, can't, ram, comp, song, tongue. So we notice that these vowels are either followed by a consonant, which is nasal consonant, or followed by a consonant plus another nasal consonant plus another consonant, which is the case with song or comp or tongue or dump. So that's why in writing phonological rule statements, we have to state that possibly there must be a vowel, another consonant after the nasal consonant. So a vowel gets nasalized in the environment before a nasal segment, possibly followed by a consonant in the same syllable. Now, how can we translate these phonological rule statements into a formal phonological rule notation? We simply write a vowel becomes plus nasal whenever it is followed by a consonant that is plus nasal, possibly followed by another consonant in the same syllable. What we write exactly? We use the symbol V between slashes to refer to a phony, a vowel phony, then followed by an arrow, which means becomes, and followed by a phonetic change, which is exactly plus nasal between brackets. And it is also followed by a slash, which means when, whenever, if. And we write the environment, the dash, followed by a C, a consonant, which is very specific consonant, and we specify the feature for that specific consonant, which is plus nasal between brackets. Then we open the parenthesis to say possibly followed by a consonant. Then we write the syllable boundary. So V vowel becomes plus nasal whenever it is followed by a nasal consonant, possibly followed by another consonant in the same syllable. Notice that the consonant between parentheses is referring to a possibility that its existence or absence will not actually affect the rule. So possibly, be it there or not be it there doesn't actually affect this rule here. Another common phonological process is the one we call assimilation. Assimilation is about when a sound affects another adjacent sound. It's exactly when a sound, be it a vowel or a consonant, tries to look similar to another adjacent sound by taking the features. So this is exactly what we mean by assimilation, and that's something we've mentioned and we've described in details in previous video lessons. Now let's look at these examples in front of you. These are examples of when we add the suffix morpheme s for plural, and when we actually add also the d morpheme for simple past. Now look at the pronunciation of these two morphemes and how it differs from one environment to another. For the morphemes, for the plural morphemes as a suffix, the pronunciation changes from one specific phonological environment to another. Look at this example. We say cups, pats, cabs, pads. Now we notice that the s sound is actually pronounced as a s in the two first words, cups and pats, but it is actually pronounced as z in the word cab and pad, cabs, pads. The same thing happens to the d sound. Look at the pronunciation of the d sound in the two words baked, raised, and also in these two words bagged and raised. So we notice that that t is actually pronounced as t in the first two words, and it changes to d, or it remains d in bagged and raised. Now the changes, or these changes, are actually governed by the phonological context or the phonological environment where exactly they exist. So if z is preceded by a voiced consonant, it is actually pronounced as z. But if it is preceded by a voiceless consonant, it's actually changes to s sound. And we notice that these two sounds agree in voicing. They become either both of them voiceless or both of them voiced. The same case happens to the d sound as a suffix morpheme for simple past. So the d sound is actually d whenever it is preceded by a voiced consonant, but it is actually pronounced as d sound whenever it is preceded by a voiceless sound or consonant. Now, as a phonological rule statement, we can say a voiced segment becomes voiceless when the preceding segment is voiceless. This is exactly the informal phonological rule as a statement. I repeat, a voiced segment becomes voiceless when the preceding segment is voiceless. Now, how can we change this into a formal phonological rule notation? We simply say a consonant that is minus sonorant becomes plus voice if it is preceded by a plus voice sound, and a consonant that is minus sonorant becomes minus voice if it is actually preceded by a minus voice. So we are actually here writing two rules, two phonological rule notations to describe one single rule or one single phonological statement. But we can add a very specific here symbol, which is exactly the alpha symbol. And if we add the alpha symbol, it means agrees in value with. So instead of writing two phonological rule notations, because we're describing either the two sounds agree in voicing, they become both of them voiced, or they agree in voicing and they become both of them voiceless. So we can use the alpha symbol, and we can write simply a minus sonorant consonant becomes alpha voice if it is preceded by alpha voice. This means that the consonant or the voicing of the consonant is determined by the preceding consonant that is actually before it. So if the preceding consonant is voiced, the s becomes voiced. If it is actually voiceless, it is actually pronounced as a voiceless consonant. Another example of assimilation in English, this time has to do with the prefix in that is added to words in order to mean the opposite. For example, conclusive plus in becomes inconclusive. Gratitude, adding the prefix in, becomes ingratitude. Possible plus the prefix in becomes impossible. Mortal plus the prefix in becomes immortal. But how do we actually pronounce in when it is actually added to the stem? Look at these examples. We say inconclusive, ingratitude, impossible, immortal. So we notice from these examples that in changes according to certain phonological environments. In, whenever it is added to conclusive, the n sound is actually changed to a velar nasal n sound. Same thing with ingratitude. The n sound is changed to a velar nasal n whenever it is added to the stem gratitude. The n sound in is changed to a m sound whenever it is added to the word possible. And the n sound in the n is changed to m again whenever it is added to the stem mortal. So inconclusive, ingratitude, impossible, immortal. Here we have assimilation. Why? And we've already talked about this in the previous videos. This is a typical case of regressive assimilation in which the second sound affects the first sound. So they agree in what we call place of articulation. We notice that the first sound in the stem, if it is, for example, k or g, which is exactly a velar consonant, the n nasal sound in changes to another nasal, which is a vowel, which is exactly the one that has the same place of articulation as the first consonant in the stem. The same case for m sound in im. So m is a bilabial. Why? Because the first sound in possible and mortal is a bilabial. So we have here place of articulation agreements. So how can we translate this into phonological rule statements? We simply say the prefix in becomes ing whenever it occurs before a velar consonant, and it becomes in before a bilabial consonant. That's exactly a typical case of place of articulation agreement. So how can we translate this into a formal phonological rule notation? We simply write in between slashes becomes ing between brackets whenever it is followed by another consonant that is a sonorant minus anterior minus coronal. And also in becomes im whenever it is followed by another consonant which is minus sonorant plus anterior minus coronal. Notice that the difference between a velar consonant and a bilabial consonant is exactly the features of anterior plus anterior minus anterior and minus coronal plus coronal. Bilabials are minus anterior minus coronal, but velars are actually minus anterior and minus coronal. I repeat, bilabials are plus anterior and minus coronal, while velars are minus anterior minus coronal. So we simply write the phonological rule notation as follows. In becomes ing when it is followed by a consonant that is minus sonorant minus anterior minus coronal, which is exactly a velar sound. And in becomes in whenever it is followed by a consonant that is minus sonorant plus anterior minus coronal, which is a bilabial. If assimilation is about two sounds or two adjacent sounds, one tries to look similar to the other adjacent sound by taking the features, similar features of the other sound, or by affecting the other adjacent sound. Dissimilation is about the opposite. Dissimilation is when two adjacent sounds, one of them is trying to look less similar to the other sound, of course, for the ease of pronunciation. Now let's take this example in English. Sixth, fifth. What we have here is in the last two sounds that are pronounced in these two words are actually made of a fricative consonant cluster, since in the word sixth the last two sounds you hear or you are supposed to pronounce is the s and the th, two fricatives. The same case with fifth. The last two sounds that you are actually supposed to pronounce is exactly the f sound and the th sound. So we have here a fricative consonant cluster. Now, in order to break this fricative consonant cluster, and in order to make one consonant looks less similar to the other consonants, something happens. The pronunciation of the fricative th is actually changed to a non-fricative or a stop sound t. So a phonological rule statement here is the following. The second fricative of a fricative cluster is replaced by the corresponding stop. I repeat, the second fricative of a fricative cluster is replaced by the corresponding stop, which is here in this case t sound. Now, how can we translate this into a formal phonological rule notation? We simply use the minus alpha. The minus alpha is the opposite of alpha. Alpha means agrees in value with, but if we write minus alpha, it means that it is the opposite in value to another sound. So if we use this, we can write simply the phonological rule notation as follows. So we write a consonant which is minus sonorant becomes minus alpha continuant when it is preceded by alpha continuant. In other words, a consonant, a minus sonorant consonant, takes the opposite feature of the preceding consonant continuant in terms of its continuity. So minus consonant becomes minus alpha continuant if it is preceded by alpha continuant sound. In other words, there is no agreement here, but it is actually the opposite. So the consonant tries to look less similar to the other adjacent consonants. If it is fricative, it becomes a stop. If it is a stop, it becomes continuant. Another common phonological process is the one we call in phonology devoicing. Devoicing, as it is clearly defined by its literal meaning, is exactly the opposite of voicing. When we say devoicing, it's exactly about making voiced consonants voiceless. So when you change voiced consonants to voiceless consonants, this is a typical case of what we call devoicing. As you can see in front of you, in German, devoicing takes place in certain environment and with certain sounds. If you look at these two words, for example, we have bad, which means in English bath, and we have rod, which means in English bike. Look exactly how the d sound is pronounced. We say bad, it is pronounced as bot. Rod is pronounced as rot. So the d sound, look at the phonological environment where it exists. It actually exists at the end of a word, and it is pronounced as t sound in both cases here, in both the word bod and also in the word rod. So d is changed to t. And what is the difference between d and t? We know that these two sounds are very similar when it comes to the place of articulation, and also when it comes to other features that describe these two sounds, except in one feature, which is voicing. D is a plus voice sound, while t is a voiced sound, is a voiceless sound. Now, when d is changed to its corresponding voiceless sound, this is a typical case of devoicing. So, as a phonological rule statement, we say that in German, an obstruent voiced stop gets devoiced if it occurs at the end of a word. Now, how do we change this phonological rule statement into phonological rule notation? We simply write a consonant which is minus sonorant, minus continuant, plus voice becomes minus voice whenever it is a word final. we simply write using symbols C, which is a consonant, then we define the features minus sonorant, minus continuant, plus voice, which refer exactly to obstruent voice stop. The arrow, which means becomes, the phonetic change between brackets minus voiced, slash when or whenever, then the environment before the word boundary. In other words, whenever it is a word final possession. Another example of devoicing is exactly the one that exists in English. In English, the L sound is actually a sonorant sound, and all sonorants are voiced. But there are specific phonological environments when the L sound is actually devoiced. It gets voiceless. Now look at these words in front of you. We have place, we have claim, we have booklet, we have please. Now the phonological transcription, as you can see in front of you, reveals that the L sound is voiceless here. This is very clear by adding the subscript very small ring under the L sound. That very small subscript is exactly the one that denotes or exactly signifies voiceless sound. So we notice that the L sound is actually devoiced here. But why this L sound is devoiced? If you study the environment in which exactly the L sound occurs, you will see that these four environments here share something in common, which is that the L sound is always preceded by a voiceless stop. Look at place, p, claim, k, booklet, k, please, p. So as a phonological rule statement, we say that L gets devoiced when following a syllable initial voiceless stop. I repeat, L gets devoiced when following a syllable initial voiceless stop. This is very clear since the L sound is actually following an initial voiceless stop of a certain syllable. Please or place or claim are monosyllabic words, and L is exactly after the initial sound of these monosyllabic words, which are actually voiceless stops. Except in the word booklet, which is actually a word that has two syllables. The first is book and the second is let. But we notice that here the word booklet and following exactly the principle of the maximal onset principle, which actually determines the two syllables as the following. We say booklet, booklet. So we notice that the sound in this word booklet, and specifically in the second syllable, that L is actually following a voiceless stop at the beginning of a second syllable. So a general rule to describe exactly the L devoicing here in English is the following. L gets devoiced or becomes voiceless whenever it is actually occurring after a voiceless stop in an initial syllable. So how do we translate this rule into a phonological rule statement or notation? Simply we write this. A consonant which is actually plus lateral becomes minus voice when it is a word after an initial voiceless stop, and this voiceless stop is actually defined by these features: minus sonorant, minus continuant, minus voice. And note there that we are putting a syllable boundary before this voiceless stop consonant, which means that actually this voiceless stop is actually in a syllable initial possession. So we repeat, So we write C and we define we specify the feature for that consonant, which is exactly le. There are two ways. Either you write the le between slashes becomes minus voice, or you specify the features by using C plus lateral becomes minus voice. Whenever it is syllable initial after a consonant that is voiceless stop. One of the common assimilatory phonological processes is the one we call labialization. Labialization refers to the fact that some sounds get labialized whenever they are followed by rounded vowels. So when we say labialization, we are talking about making a sound rounded, though its primary articulation does not require roundedness. Or it's exactly when a vowel is imposing its roundedness feature on the preceding consonant, though that preceding consonant does not actually require any roundedness in its primary articulation. That's the case for Nupe language, as you can see in front of you. Now, in front of you, you will notice that the g sound is normal in the word stranger. They say ega. But if they want to say a mod in this language, they say egu. If they want to say grass, they say ego. Now, the g sound in ega is normally pronounced as a velar stop. But actually in the word egu and ego, we notice that the g sound is actually labialized. This is very clear if you can see that W as a superscript, which actually denotes a secondary modification that is superimposed on the primary articulation of the g sound. But if you try to understand why, you will notice that g sound is followed by a spread vowel in the word ega. That's why there is nothing happening to the g sound. But the g sound in the two words egu and ego, we find that the g sound is followed by rounded vowels. That's why labialization is taking place. So as a phonological rule statement, we say, in this language, the lip position of rounded vowel induces a secondary modification onto the preceding consonant. In other words, get in this language gets labialized whenever it's followed by a rounded vowel. Now, how can we change this rule statement into phonological rule notation? We simply write a consonant becomes plus round whenever it is followed by a vowel that is plus round. We simply write C as a phoneme between slashes becomes plus round, and here between brackets to refer to the phonetic change, a slash, which means whenever, then we write the specify the environment with the dash, and followed by V, which refers to a vowel, and we specify the feature for a vowel, which is very important here, plus round. So consonant gets rounded whenever it is followed by another rounded vowel. C becomes plus round whenever it is followed by a V, which is plus round. Another phonological process which is very similar to labialization is exactly palatalization. Palatalization is another regressive assimilation because exactly it's the following vowel that affects the first consonant. Now, when we say palatalization, it's exactly about a sound, a consonant that actually becomes similar to a following vowel in terms of its height and also in terms of the minus roundedness and also in terms of the front position of that vowel. So if you look at the data in front of you, palatalization is very common in Russian language. Now if you look at the sound in the word dar and how it becomes when you say daryi, Look at the word or the sound m in the word dome, and look how that m is pronounced when you say domiescu. Look again at the word bomba and notice how the b sound is pronounced in bomba and how it is pronounced in the word bombiit. Look again at the pronunciation of the sounds in fugus and look how it is pronounced in the word fugusian. Now it's very clear in the pronunciation of these sounds in the word dari, domiescu, bombiit, fugusian. The r and the m and the b and the s sounds are palatalized. This is very clear from the superscript y that is actually superimposed on the primary articulation of these sounds. So this is a typical case of palatalization. But when exactly does this palatalization take place? It's very clear from the environment that these sounds or these affected sounds are actually always followed by a spread vowel, which is a front actually vowel. Now, as a phonological statement, we say, in Russian, the tongue position of a front vowel is superimposed on the preceding consonant. In other words, consonants get palatalized whenever they are followed by a spread front vowel. Now, how can we change this into a phonological rule notation? We simply say a consonant becomes plus high, minus back, minus round whenever it is followed by a plus round vowel. So, simply, we start by writing C for a consonant between two slashes, then followed by an arrow which means becomes or pronounced as. Then we specify the phonetic change between brackets and we add the features that are actually describing the change, like plus high, minus back, and minus round. This means that this consonant takes the feature of plus high, minus back, and minus round. But when? We use slash to refer to when. Then we use the environment, the dash, to refer to that specific environment where the consonant exists. And it exists exactly before V, which is a vowel. Then we open the specifications or the brackets for the specification of the features. And we add plus round and minus back, plus high. Very important because these are the features exactly that specify the occurrence of palatalization. Another phonological process that is very common in American English is the one we call glottalization. What we mean by glottalization is when we constrict the glottis in order to pronounce the glottal stop instead of the pronunciation of the t sound. If you look at the examples in front of you in English, specifically in American pronunciation, eaten, bottom, gotten, sentence, written, the way these words are pronounced, and notice here how the t is pronounced, eaten becomes eaten, bottom becomes bottom, gotten becomes gotten, sentence becomes sentence, written becomes written. So the t is pronounced in the phonological transcription. The t becomes every time in every phonological process there. Why? There is a phonological rule here which says that in American English the t sound gets glottalized whenever it is followed by a syllabic nasal, and that's exactly what is clear here in the data in front of you. So is always followed by a nasal consonant that is actually a syllabic nasal. We say it's syllabic because you will notice that it's exactly like it precedes by, or nasals n or m are like they are actually like preceding by a schwa. But that's exactly not a schwa, but that's exactly just a syllabic nasal. So whenever, as you can see, the sound is followed by a syllabic nasal, the t is pronounced sound. So eaten, eaten, bottom, bottom. So how can we try to change this glottalization rule into phonological rule notation? We simply write t becomes whenever it is followed by a consonant which is a plus syllabic nasal. Another type of phonological rules we have is the one we call Epenthesis rules. When we say epenthesis, we are talking about insertion. In the rule of insertion, the null symbol null appears to the left of the arrow and the segment to be inserted appears to the right. So we write nothing becomes something in a certain environment, in some environments. So to write it in a very formal phonological notation, we write the symbol null followed by an arrow, then we specify the phonetic change between brackets, then we open the slash, then we write the environment, then exactly we specify what kind of consonant is followed. So null becomes X here whenever it is followed by Y. So let's see some examples. If you take the example of insertion in English, insertion exists in English in many different examples, but let me give you this example. The following English plurals are matches, houses, judges, and passes. Normally, when we want to change a noun to a plural, we actually add the s sound that is actually sometimes pronounced as z. That depends on exactly the last sound that exists in the stem. So if the stem is actually voiceless, it is s. But when the last sound that is actually existing in the stem, if it is actually plus voice, it is actually pronounced z. But whenever the last sound that exists in the stem is actually sibilant, what are sibilants? Like one of these sounds, s, z, sh, j, ch, or j, we add z. So we will have a sibilant cluster. So in order to avoid that sibilant cluster, what we do exactly is that we insert a vowel E to break exactly that sibilant consonant cluster. So instead of saying matches, we say matches. Instead of saying judges, we say judges, and passes, and houses. So the phonological rule statement is the following. E is inserted to break a sibilant consonant cluster. How do you write this in the phonological rule notation? Null becomes E, we open the slash, and we specify the environment. The environment is exactly between a sibilant consonant and another sibilant consonant on the left side. Nothing becomes E if it is between two sibilant consonants. Now let's move to elision rules. When we say elision, we talk about deletion. Deletion is indicated by the symbol null. The segment which undergoes deletion appears to the left of the arrow and the null to the right. This is exactly how we write a phonological rule that describes elision. So something becomes nothing in some environment. As a phonological rule notation, we write, for example, X becomes nothing when it is followed by Y. Let's see some examples, and let's see the example in French. In French, look exactly what happens to a consonant if it is a word final and followed by another word that starts with the vowel. And look exactly what happened to that consonant when it is word final possession and followed by another word that starts with a consonant. Look at these examples. Petit ami, gros ami, trop étroit, très étroit. Petit garçon, gros garçon, trop large, très large. We notice here that the t, z, and p are actually deleted when the second coming word starts with a consonant. That's a typical case in French of elision. So consonants in French are deleted whenever they are word final followed by another word that starts with a consonant, but they are not deleted when they are word final but followed by another word that starts with a vowel. So as a phonological rule notation, we say for many words in French which terminate in a consonant, the final consonant is dropped if the following word begins with a consonant. To change this into phonological rule notation, we write consonant becomes nothing if it is word boundary and followed by another word that starts with a consonant. Another example is the one that exists in English, and this example of elision is very common for some dialects of English and for those native speakers of English who actually do not pronounce the r. Look and notice how r is pronounced in English within these words. We say farm, farm. We say dark, dark, father, father, dear, dear. The phonological transcription, as you can see in front of you, shows that r here is deleted. So, there is a phonological rule statement here in English which says, do not pronounce r if it is followed by a consonant or if it is a word final. There are two specifications, two phonological rules here, two phonological environments in which the r sound is deleted. It's either deleted if it is followed by a consonant like in the word farm or dark, or it is deleted if it is word final like in the word father and dear. So how do we change this into phonological rule notation? We simply write r between slashes becomes nothing if it is followed, and you open the braces because we are talking about two possible environments, two alternative environments. We say either followed by a plus consonantal minus syllabic, which is a consonant, or if it is a word final possession. Normally when we write rule notations, as we have seen so far, we are actually writing rule notations as standard notations. And standard notations are like this. We say A becomes B when they are followed by C. But there is another way of writing phonological rule notations. These are what we call transformational notations. When we write transformational notations, we simply describe how the environment was and how it becomes. And instead of writing A becomes B when it is followed by C, we write AC becomes BC, which is exactly the same thing. And this is exactly what we do when we write phonological rule notations for two phonological processes, coalescence and metathesis. Let's start with the first one, which is metathesis rule. When we say metathesis, it's very important to remind you of this. Metathesis is when two adjacent sounds are replacing, they are reversing their positions in order to break the consonant cluster, okay, or in order to avoid vowel cluster. Now, if you look at these examples in an Austronesian language, you look at the sounds in red are actually consonant cluster, but they are preceded by a vowel. Look how they are supposed to be pronounced and how they are phonetically pronounced. We say danat chiaviali or karpalu, but it is pronounced as dantakiaviali or krapalu. So a phonological rule here as a statement is the following. When there are three consecutive consonants, the first consonant switches positions with the preceding vowel. I repeat, when there are three consecutive consonants, the first consonant switches position with the preceding vowel, which is the case here with what happens with the sound in dantakiaviali and the preceding vowel a. A and the following consonant switches their positions in order to break the consonant cluster. So how do we write this in terms of phonological rule notation? We simply use what we call transformational notation. So we write the sequence of consonants and vowels, and we numerate them, and we show how that numeration changed when it is actually pronounced. So we write V1, C2, C3, C4 becomes C2, V1, C3, C4. So the phonemic pronunciation was the vowel is number one followed by three consecutive consonants. The first vowel switches the position with the second consonant. It becomes C2, V1, C3, and C4. This is exactly how we write a transformational rule notation for metathesis. We numerate the consonant and we show how that numeration becomes different in the phonetic representation. Now, coalescence rule. What is coalescence? Let me remind you of this. When we say coalescence, we are talking exactly about when two sounds merge together, coalesce, and they are replaced by another single sound which shares exactly the features of the two. If we take the example again here of Korean language, you will notice that whenever we add a suffix hwa, hita, ku, and ta to a stem, which is exactly nak, kup, cha, na, we notice that two consonants that become adjacent, they are replaced by one single consonant that is actually sharing these two features of the two sounds. Let me explain this. Look at nak. When it is actually added to hwa in Korean, it becomes nakhwa. Now k in nak, k ends nak, while the h starts in hwa. So k becomes adjacent to h sound and it is replaced by an aspirated k. The same case when p becomes adjacent to h in ku plus hita, the p and h are replaced by an aspirated p. Same thing for cha plus ko. H plus k are replaced by an aspirated k. The same case for na plus ta. The h sound plus the t sound are replaced by an aspirated t sound. So in the phonological rule statement, we say in Korean, whenever a continuant and the h are contiguous, are adjacent, they are replaced by an aspirated non-continuant. Now, how can we translate this into phonological rule notation? We use again a transformational rule notation as follows. So we specify the first consonant and its features, and we enumerate number one. Then we write the specifications for the second sound, which is h here, which is exactly a glide, and we enumerate it as number two. And we add the arrow and we show the exactly phonetic representation of it. So a consonant that is minus sonant minus continuant as the first, and adjacent to a glide that is minus sonant plus continuant as the second, become number one, which is the non-continuant consonant plus aspirated. So it becomes, or these two actually are coalesced and replaced by the first consonant that is the non-continuant sound with an aspiration modification there. So this is exactly how we write a phonological rule notation for coalescence. Thank you for watching this video. Please subscribe to this channel in order to stay tuned for more coming videos. Take care. Bye-bye.